4 eggs, just the eggs. And on top of that, can I get 1 grilled chicken sandwich? See ya. Hey, fatty! I'm gonna show you the flexibility of sugar fasting, you fat pigs.
Their fruit snacks. The Sour Patch Kids. Oh boy, Jolly Ranchers right here. Blow Pops, good old fashioned Blow Pops. It's great for you, it's great for your kids, right?
Overeat as much honey and sugar as I possibly can in the early part of the day.
Will the sugar diet ruin your long-term health? Well, I think it really depends on how the diet is set up. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I would structure a sugar diet to minimize potential long-term health complications. Now, I want to preface this video with, I'm not actually promoting the sugar diet or sugar fasting as the best solution for long-term health or even fat loss. But I know that many people are excited by this new diet and are looking to run the sugar fast and the sugar diet without considering some of the long-term concerns. The problem I see with this, though, is that people on social media are running sugar diets and sugar fasts in quite problematic ways with some of the foods that are being incorporated and how the fast and diet is actually set up. So I wanted to share a dietary setup that I think would be a bit more balanced overall and reasonable if you're going to run the sugar diet or sugar fast while minimizing potential long-term concerns. Further, I want to make it clear, I'm not exactly anti-sugar diet. I know in social media there's been this push that Jay and I are on one side, and then Mark and Anabology and these other people are on this other side. And I'm not looking to create a culture war around carbohydrates. I think overall, the elimination of sugar fear is a great thing, particularly for whole food, fruit-based sugars. And it's something that I've been personally discussing, incorporating these whole food fruit-based sugars for over 6 years now publicly. So I think this is a good shift. However, I do think the way that these diets are set up and the sugar sources that are incorporated and that make up the base of the diet need to be set up in a reasonable and rational way. This is especially the case when we are looking to not only lose body fat, but also optimize overall health and avoid getting caught up in hypes and new fad diets that ultimately solve some issues, right? People coming from low carb start to have carbohydrates and feel a bit better while creating new issues. So the goal is to create a dietary setup that optimizes the pros here and minimizes the cons. And that's what I'm going to try to do with some of the setup here in this video while still allowing people to run the sugar diet if that's something that they're looking to do. Now, I do think that people who are currently promoting the diet heavily at this point in time, like Cole Robinson and like Mark Bell, I'm not sure they are fully aware of the longer term concerns. I know this is something new that they've both just done recently, and they both came from more extreme lower carb diets and long-term fasting diets that they promoted heavily as well. And I also don't think that they knew at that point in time the longer term concerns. So I think when you're going into this dietary setup, I think it's great that people are losing weight, but ultimately I think you want to know the pros and the cons and get the full picture before you embark on something. And again, it doesn't mean that the sugar diet concept is bad or that I'm against this type of diet. It's more, is there a reasonable way to actually set up the diet to minimize some of these longer term concerns while still allowing yourself to lose the body fat that you're looking to lose at a reasonable pace? Now, with this, I am going through the mechanisms of FGF21 and some of the other components for the sugar diet. And I'm creating a presentation on this, and that is going to come out relatively soon, so stay tuned. But in the meantime, I want to share the dietary setups that I think could be helpful while you're running a sugar diet to minimize these longer term concerns. Now, before we jump in, if you're interested in working with me directly to set up a sustainable, healthy diet that provides ample amount of carbohydrates and even sugars while optimizing your blood glucose levels and losing body fat and improving your metabolic markers simultaneously, I just reopened a limited number of new spots in my exclusive coaching program. In the program, you'll be able to directly speak with me 7 days per week and get my personalized guidance to rebuild your health. So if you're interested, head over to MikeFave.com right now to grab your spot. So in a previous video, I covered the major practical concerns with sugar fasting, or at least I covered some of them just initially, which I'll link that video in the description. But to summarize some of these concerns, they included having too little protein in the diet over a longer time period, which I would consider 100 days a longer term period to have very low protein intake. And this I thought would lead to issues with lean mass over this time frame, as well as with satiety. I'm going to expand on some of those components in this video. On top of that, I mentioned or discussed the problems having too low fat inside a sugar diet, again, over this sugar fasting, over this 100-day time frame. And I think this would lead to issues with digestion and also with hormonal problems. And I'll go into a little bit more depth here when I show the dietary setups. And I also thought that the way that the diet was being promoted with Sour Patch Kids and jelly beans and things like this, which I know now has shifted. Even Mark has started to use more fruits, which I think is a really great shift. I think those are really problematic sources to base the diet around. Even if you're losing weight, I really think it's not a great idea to not incorporate those carbohydrate sources as a major carbohydrate sources in the diet. And also there are oral health concerns with the high amounts of sugars. And again, I'm a fan of high sugar intake, but when I did high sugar intake from the refined sources, it actually wrecked my teeth. And so I think that is a concern, even over a 100-day time frame. So in order to rectify these issues as best as possible within the sugar diet context, right? Or setting up a diet within that sugar diet context, I set up 2 different example days in Chronometer. Now, these are more akin to a 16-8 or a 24 intermittent fast. So basically you have a 16-hour fasting window or sugar fasting window with an 8-hour eating window that incorporates protein, or a 20-hour sugar fasting window that has a 4-hour protein eating window, rather than just a straight sugar fast. This is more in alignment with Anabology's honey diet, which I think is a much more reasonable and sound approach to the diet than Cole Robinson's 100-day sugar fast. I think there's quite a few problems with the 100-day sugar fast, and even the perspective that Cole has presented in some of the videos where he's sugar fasting and then he's going and getting McDonald's when he breaks the fast. I don't think from a long-term health perspective, which is where I'm coming from, this is necessarily a good idea, even if people are losing weight with that. So I don't deny the weight loss, but I do think ultimately having the body composition that you want while having long-term health is extremely important. So with this, I have 2 example days that I built down in Chronometer. Now, I know the goal with the sugar fast is not to actually track in Chronometer or heavily track, but for articulation purpose and also for visualization purpose, so I can show you how I would set these things up, I am using Chronometer to give you some breakdown with some of the dietary setup. So first things first here, the first 4 meals of the day, so meal 1, meal 2, meal 3, meal 4, these have no protein in the meals. It's just fruits. There's a minimal amount from whatever is in the fruits. The last meal of the day here is the protein meal. And I think there's a variety of benefits to doing this, and I'm going to go through them step by step here. Logistically, how you set up the diet, I think, is important. The reason why I say this is a lot of people are actually working, right? Like I work full time. I know when I was working in the ICU, or I was working in the hospital, or my clients, they're all working full time. They have families, they have kids, they have spouses, etc. So having some reasonable setup for the diet that allows you to ease your prep time and consistently hit your caloric targets as well as your micronutrient targets, I think will be important. So I basically tried to streamline the diet here and make 4 separate shakes that are basically just 100% fruit juice with some fruit, and then there's some dried fruit on the side. So logistically, if you set up the shakes, I think this would be a lot easier because you can just put all this in a blender and blend it all up and divide it in 4 portions, or maybe depending on the size of your blender, you'll have to do 2 different blending sessions. And when I was in the ICU, that's basically what I did. I would have shakes 4 times a day because I didn't have time to eat. We didn't really get a work break or a lunch break when I was there. So I would just have shakes throughout the day and I could drink them. And I was a setup very similar to this, but I had whey protein inside the shake so I could get enough protein across the day, which obviously you're not doing here because this is a sugar diet. Now, outside of the logistical benefit of running the shakes and using the fruit, which it is a lot easier than having to cook all day long, the carb sources that I've chosen here are mainly 100% fruit juice, whole fruits, and dried fruits. Now, there's a couple reasons why I've done this. When we're looking at the whole fruit, the 100% fruit juice, and the dried fruit, the nutrient density of these things is actually pretty decent, especially at these quantities. So you can get quite a bit of vitamins and minerals. So I'm just going to highlight here all the fruit sources. And you can see a lot of vitamins and minerals across the day are topped off by these fruit sources, including potassium, getting quite a bit of potassium intake, which can be important for overall health, for kidney function, for blood pressure, etc. So you get a variety of these vitamins and minerals. And this is really important because the vitamins and minerals are cofactors for the enzymes that allow us to take that carbohydrate and actually turn it into ATP, to turn it into energy. So you want to get enough of these components. The next thing is these fruits and the juices and whatnot the fruits contain fiber, the dried fruits contain fiber, but all of them contain polyphenols. And the polyphenols here are quite important because they actually help to shift the microbiome in a beneficial way. Whereas the refined carbohydrate sources like Sour Patch and sodas and components like this actually are not really good in the microbiome. They select or can select for an overgrowth of more pathogenic bacteria or problematic bacteria instead of probiotic species, whereas the fruits tend to, at least in the research, have beneficial impacts on the microbiome. And this is really important because if the microbiome is out of whack or you have a dysbiosis, you can leak endotoxin, which in the bioenergetic sphere is actually a huge problem. So we don't want to have large amounts of endotoxin making into the gut that can cause issues or being produced in the gut by dysbiosis that can cause issues at the liver. So the fruits actually help to minimize that instead of using some of the granulated sugar sources or the sodas or refined sources. Plus, the refined sources in the research tend to actually have a worse metabolic effect overall than if you were to use fruits and you were to use 100% fruit juices. So when you look at the papers, and I've done other videos on this, 100% fruit juice, whole fruit, and frozen fruit, way better outcomes. At the minimum neutral effects, at the maximum beneficial effects on health. Soda, sugar-sweetened beverages, etc., not such great outcomes. And then even when we look at some of the metabolic changes inside the research, the refined sources don't perform quite as well. Now, on top of that, the fruit sources that I have chosen here, which they're modular, you can switch them around. I made a video going over different sources that you can use, but these fruit sources here are actually low FODMAP fruit sources. So FODMAPs are fibers that can create bloating and gas because we can't digest them, but the bacteria in our digestive tract can, or they're more carbohydrate sources that kind of act like a fiber. And they're rapidly fermented by the GI bugs, and they can create bloating, gas, loose stools, and some of these components. So you're going to want to, especially if you have digestive issues, you're coming off a low-carb carnivore diet, you may want to select for sources that don't have a high amount of FODMAPs, so you don't have bloating and gas and develop GI issues. So that's why I've chosen these options here. Plus, they're readily available at most supermarkets, most places people can get orange juice, frozen berries, dried pineapple you can get on Amazon, and bananas are pretty much available everywhere. The other thing with the 100% fruit juice and the fruit sources is they're not high in industrial additives. So Sour Patch, lollipops, sodas, they have a bunch of terrible additives that are not good for our health, that cause issues in the GI tract. So we don't really want to have a high amount of these components, even though they're all sugar. So not all sugar sources are the same. I think that's really important to be said here. Even though you can lose weight just having all sugar, you don't want to be damaging your health long-term when you do that. So when you come out at the end, you want to have great health, optimal health, on top of losing the body fat that you wanted to lose. So I think it's important to have both things moving together instead of just one thing moving. And the weight loss will improve some of the metabolic markers, but you can still create new issues if you're using some of these other sources in the long run. Now, the next thing that I've done here is in this last meal of the day, I loaded the protein. So basically, you're going to have like maybe it's almost like a 22-hour sugar fast, right? Because you're not having any protein except for this meal. So let's call it a 2-hour window. So you only have this protein meal in the end of the day. I've set up the protein target here to be about 126 or 120 grams or so. And that is because I'm about 195 pounds. And I was looking to shoot for about 0.64 grams per pound per day, which was the target from the research that allowed for lean mass maintenance. And so this allows us to maintain our lean mass, having the protein here at the end of the day. And we're using high quality protein sources like eggs and beef and whey protein. Now I tried to use these high quality protein sources on purpose because the fruit sources and the other sources in the diet are not going to be complete have complete amino acid profiles. So you have high quality protein that's going to maintain lean mass. Now, this is absolutely essential. And the reason why maintaining lean mass is essential is so that when you lose your body fat, you want to have that lean mass high so you can maintain your resting metabolic rate. If you don't maintain your resting metabolic rate, what happens? Rebound weight gain. So if you lose all this muscle tissue on the back end, when you start to eat normally again, because I assume people aren't trying to sugar fast the rest of their lives, you'll wind up in a circumstance where you start to put the weight back on. So we want to actually maintain our lean muscle tissue. And an example of this, if you look at people who are running fruitarian diets, they tend to lose quite a bit of muscle tissue. Now, I know people are not advocating running long-term fruitarian diets, but that is something to keep in mind as an extreme example of what happens when you're just using sugars and you don't have adequate protein is you lose that lean muscle tissue, which I think is highly problematic. The other thing I want to mention here is a lot of people are saying, hey, my weight is going down on the scale super rapidly. You know, that's great. I'm happy that people are seeing that progress. It's really important. It keeps people motivated. And I think it allows people to actually make long-term health changes because they actually see the progress instead of feeling like it's deathly slow. But on the flip side, if you lose weight half as fast, but most of that is coming from your fat tissue, that is better than losing weight twice as fast, whereas a large portion of that is coming from your muscle tissue. So you really want to be seeing a loss of body fat specifically with as little lean tissue loss as possible. Now, I know Mark says, oh, every weight loss diet is going to lead to some amount of lean tissue loss. That is true. However, it's not a question of if it happens or not. It's a question of how much lean muscle tissue is lost. And when you have your own home gym and you're taking TRT, it's a little bit different of a setup than it is for somebody who doesn't have those components dialed in like Mark does. So the context changed a little bit. And I think it's important that you don't lose that lean muscle tissue. I think that's one of the biggest components here to consider. On top of this, with the proteins, there's other benefits besides the lean muscle tissue, or not even just lean muscle tissue, but lean tissue in general, bones, organs, skin, etc. If you don't have enough protein, you don't provide enough amino acids for neurotransmitter production, for enzymatic function, and also for liver metabolic functions. So you want to have enough of the amino acids coming in the diet. If you just did the sugar stuff, we can see this here in Chronometer. So this is only the sugar source, not putting the last meal in. You can see that a lot of the amino acid targets are not hit with this diet. These amino acids are needed by the body. And if you don't have these amino acids, it's not just for energy. Everything doesn't just come down to energy. They are structural components. They are components that are used for enzymatic function. They are components that are used for neurotransmitter production. The intestine can use the amino acids like glutamine as well as an energy source. So you want to have an adequate amount of these amino acids over time. I think the 100-day time frame is pretty long to actually run a deficit of these things, especially when the major amino acid that needed to be restricted for the FGF21 signaling in the bump in metabolic rate was specifically isoleucine. So that's something to consider. Amino acids like vitamins and minerals are needed for a variety of metabolic functions, and ignoring that is a problem. The last thing I'll mention here with the protein, when protein is metabolized, the amino group gets taken off and it gets converted to ammonia and runs through the urea cycle. The urea cycle produces a compound in there, has a compound, one of the intermediaries called carbamoyl phosphate. Carbamoyl phosphate is important for upregulating the fluid flow, the dentinal fluid flow through your teeth to help remineralize the teeth. So I think on a sugar diet, if you don't have some of that protein coming in with all the sugar, and this is something I experienced personally, it can start to damage your teeth, especially in a 100-day window. So I'd be very careful with running a sugar fast without the protein, and pay attention to your teeth. Again, like I looked into this because I did a high sugar diet with granulated sugar and wrecked my teeth, like really wrecked my teeth. And it took me some time to recover it. So I'll talk about that at the end of the video here, my experience with it. But that's something to keep in mind. And the protein, I think, can be helpful to minimize some of that. The next component here are the fat sources. So in the back end of the day here, I added the fat sources with the eggs, the macadamia nuts. Obviously, those are trying to be lower polyunsaturated fats overall. And there's going to be a little bit here when we look at this from the meat. So about 15 grams from mac nuts, mostly monos, 9 grams from eggs, and then 5 grams of beef. So I added the eggs here to actually provide some choline and some of the micronutrients to help with liver's processing. And I shifted more to the monounsaturated fat sources with the macadamia nuts while keeping polyunsaturated fats low so that the liver has some of the pressure removed off fixture. Really, you're upregulating FGF21, restricting amino acids and pushing high sugars. So some of these things may be helpful overall to take some of the pressure off the liver. The other thing I added is with the fats, I put the fat soluble nutrients in here, right? So we have D3K2, some beef liver, that'll have some vitamin A, and then some vitamin E. So these are the 4 fat soluble nutrients, and they're present in the meal that has quite a bit of fat. This is important because in some of the FGF21 research I'm going through, it doesn't have such favorable effects on bone mass. So we want to make sure we have the vitamin D, the vitamin K, and then obviously I added micronutrients across the day, some magnesium, some calcium, some zinc to make sure everything was topped off so that you can maintain your bone mass through this process, and also you have those cofactors that are needed for the metabolic processes overall. So these are only going to be absorbed when there's fat present. So I put them in this last meal because if you throw them at other points in the day, you probably won't absorb those fat soluble nutrients so well because there is no fat. So I added those here to optimize that and minimize issues down the line. And also, besides the bone component, something to mention with the vitamin E component is if you are liberating lots of fats from your tissues and you've been on a Western diet for a long period of time and have quite a bit of body fat, you want to make sure that you actually have adequate amounts of vitamin E present, because the vitamin E is going to protect against the lipid peroxidation products that are coming from the polyunsaturated fats stored in your fat tissue. So the vitamin E here, I think, would be helpful to minimize some of the excess lipid peroxidation, as well as the D3K2 protecting the bones. So this is extremely important. The next piece is with the fat in the back end of the meal, you'll actually trigger gallbladder release of bile acids into the small intestine. Now, this is multifold benefit. Benefit number one, the bile acids clear out the small intestine of bacteria and detoxify endotoxins in the small intestine. If you don't have the bile flow, it can create digestive issues. And I've seen this in quite a few people that I've worked with on a one-to-one basis when they've tried to do high sugar, very low fat diets. So you want to have that bile flow. It also stimulates bowel motility because the bile acids trigger the peristaltic action in the intestine. So we want to have some of the bile acids going in on a consistent basis. The bile acids also help the liver to detox. When the liver processes different components, it drops in the bile, and then when the bile is dropped into the intestine, the fibers pull the bile out, and it helps the liver to detoxify. If you don't have the bile going into the small intestine and the fibers gripping onto some of those bile acids and pulling them out, the bile is just recirculated between the small intestine and the liver, and you don't actually get to have the excretion of that bile acid. On top of that, if the bile isn't secreted from the gallbladder into the small intestine, you can basically get sludge or thick bile, or you can also get gallstones because the bile sits there and it super saturates in the gallbladder over time. And people who have done very low fat weight loss diets can actually develop gallbladder issues from some of these components. So it's important to have some of the bile flow going into the intestine to support the liver and clear out the small intestine. So if you have some fat at night, I think that'll be helpful for that. The last thing I want to mention here with protein and fat, the protein and the fat is helpful to stabilize your blood sugar over the course of the night. Now, when I did a very low fat, very high carb diet, basically what I ran into is I couldn't sleep at night. It didn't happen right away. It took probably a couple weeks or so, but I couldn't sleep at night because my blood sugar was all over the map. I couldn't fall asleep and I was waking up every hour because my fat was just way too low. I did still have protein, so I think it's mainly related to the fat. So I think having fat in the last meal can help stabilize your blood sugar across the night so that you can actually get some sleep, which is another thing that's important. I think some people may run into issues with sleep as they run this diet longer term because they're going to have the blood sugar swings across the night. And on top of that, they're going to be in a circumstance where they may drive up catecholamines, adrenaline and noradrenaline with the low fat intake because those hormones are being released so that you can release some of the fats from your tissues through lipolysis. And then basically that they also create an excited state, like they have an awakening type of state, an anxiety producing state for some people. So for me, that's something that I experienced. Now, there's one more example I want to show you here the second day. It's the exact same thing as the first day. The only difference is I added collagen protein here, which you can see in each meal. So there's there, and then this is still at the end of the day, same protein sources. Now, the collagen protein allowed me to bring the protein intake up from 120 grams per day to about 162 grams per day. Now, I don't think everybody needs to eat this much protein. This is my personal target based on my body weight. Right? I'm shooting for 0.82 grams per pound, about 195 pounds. So I'm shooting for roughly 160, 170 grams per day. But the collagen is a great source here because it's very low in isoleucine, which is the main thing that is upregulating FGF21 is low isoleucine status. And that's what people are looking to do. That's the theory behind the sugar diet, the honey diet, etc. Maybe cold didn't necessarily intend it to be that way. But when you start talking about these diets, people are looking to upregulate FGF21, and isoleucine restriction is the most important. So I highlighted the 4 top meals. And if we look here, isoleucine is only 1 gram, and only 0.5 grams is actually coming from the collagen. The rest is coming from the fruits. So it's still quite a low isoleucine intake. So you may be able to get a higher protein intake across the day from the collagen protein, get the rest of your complete amino acids at night in this meal, while still upregulating the FGF21 if that is something that you're looking to do. Again, I'm going to talk about the pros and the cons of that in a separate video. So this is the same day. It just has the collagen present so that you could increase your protein intake a little bit, as well as having a complete protein at the last meal here for this intermittent sugar fasting setup. Now, the last piece I want to talk about here is my experience with low fat, very high carb, particularly refined carbohydrates. So I already mentioned the sleep piece. Another piece that happened over time to me, took a couple of weeks or so. I basically was doing orange juice, like gallon orange juice a day or half a gallon, depending, very low fat milk and shrimp. And I was adding granulated sugar and like eating granulated sugar to the milk and the orange juice, like 50 to 75 teaspoons per day. What wound up happening when I did this is first thing after a couple of weeks, I had to eat every hour. My blood sugar was dropping and I had to eat to get it back up. So I was getting adrenaline rushes. I was feeling the blood sugar crashes. Didn't really feel so great doing this. On top of that, I was having a lot of anxiety. Typically, I'm not an anxious person, but I was quite anxious during this time frame. I couldn't relax. So I was getting cold hands, cold feet. It's getting sweaty. I think that was through because of the blood sugar changes, because the lack of fat in the diet was pushing lipolysis, driving up the catecholamines. On top of this, I was in my early 20s and my libido absolutely tanked, took a huge nosedive. Never had issues with libido before until I did this diet. My libido was terrible. And I think that was largely related to not having enough fat in the diet. So it's very low, as less than the 20% of fat that I typically recommend as the lowest mark when I'm working with clients one-to-one, or even for myself. On top of this, I mentioned I absolutely destroyed my teeth. So I eroded all the bottoms of my teeth, and the tops of my teeth just around the gum line. And it took some time to actually recover some of that my teeth were in pretty bad shape for a while. I was really sensitive overall. So that was related, I think, to the refined carbohydrate source, the sugars that I was using on a consistent basis. When I switched to 100% fruits, when I started having protein in the meal and having it after I had the 100% fruit juice, the whole fruits, dried fruits, frozen fruits, things like this, teeth started to recover on top of vitamin D3, vitamin K2, calcium, magnesium, which those are all the things that I set up in these sugar diet examples so that you don't have to have the same problem that I did and have to go to the dentist and be like, oh yeah, your teeth are pretty messed up, man. What have you been doing? Oh, 50 to 75 grams of sugar a day. So yeah, so I was able to recover my teeth. But if I kept going the way I was going to lose teeth for sure. I was on my way to having some serious dental issues. So these are concerns that I think that I personally experienced when I ran this high sugar, very low fat setup. To be fair, I still had protein present, but I don't think the having the protein or not resolves those issues. I think the fat being too low and using the refined sugar sources were the drivers in this particular circumstance. The last piece I'll mention here is obviously during this time frame, I did have some body fat to lose because when I tried this diet, I was coming off of like a higher milk dairy diet when I was trying some of the like core bioenergetic stuff, which I didn't do well with. It made me gain quite a bit of weight. I was like maybe 18%, 16% body fat, somewhere around there. Typically I sit around 10 to 12 naturally, maybe sometimes up to 14, but I had quite a bit to lose when I was doing the bioenergetic stuff. And once I got down, as I got leaner, I was still active. I was playing basketball, I was biking, I was working out and lifting. The low fat really took a toll on me. Now I have clients who have type 2 diabetes, who are obese, and when they do lower fat, the effects aren't as significant as what I experienced, but they do still get some of these side effects when they run the lower fat diets. Even though they have the body fat, I still think the signaling for some people triggers some of these blood sugar rushes, the lack of stability with the meal, and the anxiety and the issues of sleeping at night. And obviously the refined sources still, I think, impact people's teeth. So I do think context changes how people are able to respond to components. But these are some experience that I've seen with myself and with clients who are overweight, who are trying lower fat diets and who have diabetes, because some of the lower fat diets can be helpful with people with diabetes. And even lower protein intake can be helpful in diabetes because of the effects of BCAAs and some of the amino acids on gluconeogenesis and also insulin signaling. So with that, that'll wrap up the video here. You can use these templates. Feel free to try them out. You can mix and match to different fruit sources or use different protein sources you like. It was just supposed to be examples. I do have a separate video that I recommend you check out where I basically cover the carbohydrate sources. I rank them based on digestibility, based on their effects on blood sugar, and based on micronutrient status. So you can check those out. I'll link the video in the description, and I'll catch you all in the next video.